Welcome to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brian Griffith, and here's what's going down this week in your backyard and across the world. This week, we are once again focusing on Venezuela and kind of bringing updates to the attempted coup by Juan Guaido, the kind of right-wing coup that we talked about and have been discussing at length since Guaido first declared himself to be president in January. There has been an attempt by the U.S. to, force through, as I'm sure you've heard, what the Trump administration is calling humanitarian aid. After that, there was the kind of emergency declared, by essentially when the Trump administration brought the United Nations Security Council to an emergency meeting to discuss the situation that they themselves seem to have created in Venezuela to attempt to force shipments of unknown origin into Venezuela. That's kind of where we are at the moment. Juan Guaido, meanwhile, the so-called self-declared president, immediately fled Venezuela, found himself meeting essentially with the extreme right-wing governments of first Ivan Duque in Colombia and then with Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, who, of course, is tied to the earlier Brazilian military dictatorship there. It appears, from last I heard, it appears that Juan Guaido may now be meeting in Paraguay, essentially trying to, shore up support by the so-called Lima group. So we're going to be talking about all of this and more in the next half hour. Essentially, what do we know now about who Juan Guaido is, where his loyalties lie? What was this so-called humanitarian aid? I'd like to, of course, get into Elliot Abrams, who has been spearheading this attempt to force regime change in Venezuela and so much more. To be joining us to talk about all of this and more is Paul Dobson, who's an editor with Venezuelanalysis. Thank you very much, Paul, for coming on the show once again.
My pleasure, Brian. My pleasure.
So I know that was a kind of a long setup. We talked, I think it was about a month ago or so, around the time Guaido had declared himself. Let's start with kind of the flashpoint here with the so-called humanitarian aid that the U.S. attempted to force across the border. What sort of was this about? Why is the story kind of more complicated than the U.S. is trying to kind of let on here?
Well, the issue of the aid was a very clearly manufactured flashpoint, which had political motives behind it. It's very important that all of your listeners are clear that the issue about the so-called aid, which the U.S. were trying to force into Venezuela, had practically nothing to do with aid or helping the Venezuelan people themselves. No? Now, why do I say this? A few issues. Firstly, it would be the height of hypocrisy for the government which has done the most in the world to lower the living standard in Venezuela, to hurt the Venezuelan people, to block imports of vital medicines and foodstuffs, to then come out with a line that they are trying to send aid to help the people of Venezuela because they're really that nice. No, this is completely untrue. This is just political spin from the White House. The White House has and is increasing its sanctions against Venezuela, which make it ever more difficult for a Venezuelan to lead a normal and average standard of life. Secondly, the aid which the US were proposing to send to Venezuela amounted to somewhere in the region of $20 million worth of food. There were no medicines or drugs amongst this aid. It was entirely food and very basic personal hygiene supplies, according to the agency which was supplying it, which is none other than USAID, a department or a branch of the US State Department. $20 million. $20 million is a drop in the ocean. The latest oil embargo announced by the White House on Venezuela is costing the country $30 million a day. A day. So the amount of aid which the US were actually proposing, which would, according to them, solve the economic problems and save the lives of all of the poor Venezuelans, doesn't even amount to more than a day's worth of the economic impact of the very same sanctions which they applied. No? When you look at the aid itself, It was essentially very basic foodstuffs, lentils, flour, grains, things like this, cooking oil, which would have supplied around 7,000 Venezuelans for 10 days. Any sort of, you don't have to be an economist, but any brief look at the Venezuelan economic problems will tell you that no solution will come to the economy by supplying 7,000 people with lentils for 10 days. The Venezuelan economic problems are entirely structural, are deep-rooted, and entirely macro. By putting a band-aid on these problems, by sending a little bit of flour and beans, you're really not going to solve hyperinflation. You're really not even going to start to address the dependence on oil and the lack of production of other goods in the country, which are some of the major causes of the economic crisis, a very real and devastating economic crisis here in Venezuela. So what we essentially can see is that the White House, along with their lackey in Venezuela, Juan Guaido, attempted to dress up a band-aid for the economic problems, which would have had practically no impact whatsoever, sell it to the media, sell it to the world in the spirit of goodwill and international charity, and as such, try to achieve their political objectives. Now, what were their political objectives? The entry of this aid was conditioned on two fundamental aspects. Firstly, it was conditioned on the elected president, Nicolas Maduro, stepping down from power, despite the fact that his constitutional term sees him through until 2025. It was also conditioned on the forced violation of Venezuela's territorial sovereignty. This was an issue which I think no country in the world would have accepted, starting with the United States. Sometimes it's interesting just to switch the coin a little bit and look at the other side of things. If a group of 500 Mexicans got together at El Paso on the Mexican-US border and said, we want to send some goods across the United States to help the 60 million people living on the streets in Los Angeles, just one city, not even the whole country. We're going to force this aid across the border. What would the reaction of Donald Trump have been? What would the reaction of the US military have been? Would they allow it across the border, or would they have defended the country's sovereignty and said no? I think this is a very normal reaction for any government in the world to take. So the events seen on February 23rd, when this flashpoint came to a head, were built up in this context of a media circus with political objectives, which most international bodies recognize. The United Nations denounced it as politicized. The Red Cross, Oxfam, War Child all turned their back on this aid program, saying this had nothing to do with aid whatsoever. It was really merely the United States State Department and their local allies involved in this. Now, the events of February 23rd itself were obviously distressing. There was acts of violence at the border. We did see confrontations with the Venezuelan security forces defending the country's territorial sovereignty, following the orders of its president, Nicolas Maduro. There are a few well-dressed lies about what happened on that day. For example, there is many images of a truck of aid being set on fire, and many pointing the finger at the Venezuelan authorities for this. Actually, on the ground, journalists and witnesses indicated that it was the very same opposition activists who set fire to their own truck to try to generate this sort of media circus and international opinion about Venezuela. Now, so this is a very well-constructed, very cleverly constructed spin about the reality in Venezuela, about the impact of the aid, and it was merely an effort for the United States to try to achieve regime change where they have failed through other corridors.
And I think, there are so many points I'd like to touch on here. First of all, I'd like to mention once again that, this aid was, or this, alleged aid was forced through against the will of the United Nations and the Red Cross, who both widely condemned it. I've heard reports. It seems that the opposition has been essentially trying to dress up some of this aid in Red Cross logos, essentially illegally using the Red Cross's logo, essentially to try to make the kind of photo op here look better. And I think that that's worth realizing that the Red Cross itself has absolutely condemned this publicity stunt. The United Nations condemned this publicity stunt. I also want to mention that Russia and China have actually, and among other countries, I believe Cuba has participated in this as well, but many countries have actually been able to supply aid to Venezuela because they have done so on terms that were more in line with international law and United Nations law, that they weren't trying this rogue strategy. And if this, if this sounds ridiculous to people, it's worth mentioning, of course, that Elliot Abrams, the man who's been spearheading this, has literally used this exact same strategy in other countries in Latin America. He was, a huge part of the Iran-Contra affair, selling weapons to the right-wing extremist Contras in the 80s. It couldn't be more kind of transparent that these are the exact same people who at points in the in the 1980s and late 1970s were doing the exact same thing, which is using humanitarian kind of alleged humanitarian aid shipments that they knew would not have an actual impact on kind of humanitarian on food shortages or whatnot, using that as a pretense to smuggle in weapons. That's a thing that Elliot Abrams has done in the past. So to say that it's outlandish to believe that this was not, I guess it's very clear, what the kind of intentions of Abrams and Trump are, and it's clearly not aid. It's not for the Venezuelan people. For those people who might be interested in, the kind of food situation in Venezuela with regard to the shortages and whatnot, it's worth mentioning that not only is this aid less than worth less than a single day's amount of what's being lost. You said, I think it was a $20 million worth of aid, but Venezuela is losing $30 million per day because of the sanctions that the U.S. has placed on them. But it's also a drop in the bucket compared to Venezuela's own the CLAP program, which is the kind of public food distribution program that I believe is able to distribute food 2 or 3 times a day to millions of people who are suffering the most. That kind of structure is already in place. There's a very good article that I think people would benefit from kind of checking out, called The Politics of Food in Venezuela. I'll try and post a link on the website to that runs down kind of the real food situation from a more independent analysis. I'm wondering I'm wondering if you have any sort of thoughts on this. Like, what is the actual food situation with regard to either the CLAP programs or other kind of government initiatives to essentially keep people fed and housed at the point of these kind of devastating sanctions that were imposed unilaterally by the United States?
Well, I think the situation has changed, and this is something we have to be very clear on. And also, I'm talking with certain authority here based in Venezuela. I travel a lot across the country. I have a lot of contacts, remain in contact, and it's something I monitor very closely here in the country. Around 4 or 5 years ago, especially when President Chavez passed away, there were very significant and widespread shortages. We're talking about food here. Let's talk about food specifically. For example, micro example, it would take a normal person 10 or 12 stops around town to try and find a box of eggs. No, because in the first 10 to 11, he wouldn't find them, or she wouldn't find them. No, this was the shortages. You would have to go to 10 different supermarkets to find washing powder, for example, because there was just no washing powder anywhere else. No, this was the impact of the shortages 5 or 6 years ago. Since, the situation has changed. What hasn't changed is the US-led media campaign to try to keep this as the so-called status quo about what people believe is happening in Venezuela. No? Currently in Venezuela, you can find nearly everything that you are looking for in terms of food and personal hygiene. Okay. You don't have to shop around. You go in one block, you can go to 3 supermarkets, and all 3 supermarkets will have 90% of the products of standard Venezuelan diet and household consumption. Okay. Obviously, there are 1 or 2 very specific or luxurious goods, which you maybe won't be able to find here in Venezuela very easily. Blue cheese, French mustard, things like this. Let's say, no caviar, I don't know, but 95% of basic consumption, household consumption, you can find nearly everywhere in every shop at the moment in Venezuela. This has changed. The problem today, Brian, is not shortages. The problem today is that there is a huge disparity between income and prices. No? Whereas you can find nearly all of these goods, a basic minimum wage will buy you 2 boxes of eggs a month. No? This is where hunger is coming from. This is where people's dietary problems are coming from. No? And this is where any sort of influx of aid into the country will really not help whatsoever, because the problem is not supply at the moment. The problem is cost structures. No? So we have to be very clear about this. Now, when we're talking about medicine, medicine is a different situation. The situation of the drugs in Venezuela is different. You can find at the moment in Venezuela easily the vast array of basic day-to-day drugs. No? But anything specialized, there is a huge shortage of specialized drugs in Venezuela. So here we're talking about anti-cancer medicine, Parkinson's drugs, even some specialist antibiotics, for example. This sort of stuff is very hard to find. And these shortages need to be addressed by the government and are to some extent being addressed. The same weekend, the US tried to force their aid into the country. The government received 7.5 tons of high-range medicines from Russia. They've also submitted to a list to the European Union of $2 billion worth of high-level drugs, which they need help in acquiring. They're willing to pay for them. They just need help in evading the US sanctions and actually getting them into the country. No? So this is a sort of specified attention, international help, which, yes, a country does need and which the government are trying to work through at the moment. What we don't need here in Venezuela is more rice and more lentils, which will keep us going or keep a small section of the country going for a few days. That will really not help the problem at all. So I think when we look and we do an analysis of the Venezuelan economic problems, we can start to look at some sort of potential solutions to these problems. And by doing so, we can discard some of the more dressed up solutions which have come from the White House and their men here in Venezuela, which are, again, purely political.
Sticking to the point of food, since that's been the kind of pretense for all of this, I'd also like to get into kind of what the role of the black market in Venezuela has been. I know there has been kind of this power struggle between, from my understanding, a power struggle between the state and kind of these the private actors, the business owners who represent the minority in the country, but who are very hostile to the Bolivarian government. And so, we've seen, from my understanding, like huge kind of inflation problems and problems kind of judging the value of the currency. I'm wondering sort of, with not just the role of the sanctions, but also kind of what is being done within the country by the kind of private business owners to sabotage the Venezuelan economy or to create the illusion that the Venezuelan economy is failing on that level because of, quote unquote, because of the government.
The vast majority of the Venezuelan business class sectors are interested essentially in making money. No, now this sometimes means importing goods illegally from Colombia and reselling at higher prices. No, sometimes it will mean setting up fraudulent schemes to swindle low or subsidized currency of the government and a whole range of other goods. No. But essentially, behind all of this is a problem of inflation. Were it not for the inflation or the hyperinflation in Venezuela, the situation of hoarding goods would not be profitable. No? If you fill a warehouse full of basic goods and in a country without any sort of inflation, you're not making any money. In Venezuela, it's very profitable to do this because the sale price is huge. The cost price you buy goods at. Equally, the inflation has a lot to do with the smuggling, what we call here the pachaquero, so the black market smuggling of goods. If an average citizen can find the goods they're looking for at reasonable prices easily, then they will have no need to turn to the black market to find the same goods. The black market, to some extent, has come forth or been born from the shortages we saw 5 or 6 years ago, and since the problems in terms of the income price disparities, to the extent that people now often return to the smugglers, black market is, to buy their goods, because in the shops maybe they're more expensive. So we see a very complex situation here of interconnecting dynamics in the economic field. The government have taken some measures against these. It has to be said the large majority of the measures the government have attempted have not had the desired impact. However, we are starting to see, according to my analysis, over the last month or two at least, certain stability returning to one or two key goods in the Venezuelan economy, which has largely got to do with the certain stability which has also returned to the black market exchange rates, which are used to determine the prices of a lot of the goods.
There does seem to be a weird kind of return to stability in such an incredibly uncertain time, from what I'm hearing of that.
Without a doubt, yes. But we have seen, for example, one of the key measures the government have brought about over the last 2 months, actually coincidentally coincided with this attempted coup d'etat, was a renovation in the exchange rates, whereby the so-called official massively subsidized exchange rate, which previously existed, has now been to some extent revalued at essentially the black market exchange rate. And at some point over the last couple of weeks, above the black market exchange rate. This has helped to bring a little bit of stability to the exchange rate system, and as such, the prices of imported goods, be they through legal channels or extra legal channels, have remained a little bit more stable, which will have a knock-on effect as well. It starts sowing the culture of price stability. And this is a counterculture to inflationary culture, which is everything goes up, even in the space of hours. No? If we can start to break down this culture, again, like I say, with a few key goods, which people often use as reference points in the Venezuelan economy, a case of beer, a box of eggs, things like this, then we might start to see the beginning of an end to this hyperinflationary crisis.
Yeah, I certainly think that would be welcome news, given essentially what we've been talking about, which is that the vast majority of the problems with kind of the Venezuelan economy are coming from this kind of tactic that goes back to actually Kissinger. If you look at, for instance, Chile, Kissinger's exact words before they essentially announced the coup against Chile, the Pinochet coup that everyone will be somewhat familiar with, his kind of words were going to make the economy scream. And so that this is kind of this time-tested strategy of, placing the sanctions on a country, letting these sanctions destroy the economy, then looking for some sort of unrest as an excuse to then overthrow the government and replace it with somebody who's more keen to your interest, which is, it's the same strategy used time and time again from Mossadegh in Iran, Pinochet, and you can look at basically every example of a CIA regime change operation. The fact that this aid came, kind of circling back around to the point of this kind of humanitarian aid, quote unquote humanitarian aid that came at the border, comes from U.S. aid. U.S. aid is kind of an off-split originally of the CIA in certain ways. It was formed after the Church Committee. It's very obvious. It's almost not even hidden that this is a regime change operation anymore, and it cannot be seen as anything but a coup. In many ways, kind of a failed coup, which is why Juan Guaido immediately kind of fled the country and started meeting with other kind of right-wing, essentially totalitarian leaders in the area. First Ivan Duque, and then Jair Bolsonaro. For those people who may not be following exactly what Juan Guaido has proposed for the country, he has proposed some incredibly, if he were to take power, if this, what appears to be a failing coup, if this were to actually succeed, what his economic and social proposals for the country would be the complete dismantling of everything that's essentially propping the country up right now. It would be the complete dismantling of, the massive public housing program and, the food programs. It would lead to hunger and homelessness and shortages. I'm wondering if you can go into a little bit more detail as to exactly what it is that Juan Guaido has proposed, what this man really is all about.
Well, as yet, he still hasn't presented any sort of plan of government to the country. I mean, he's still a long, long way away from assuming governmental powers in Venezuela. He has no power base here at all whatsoever in terms of the state. He has a following in the population, but in terms of taking control of the country, he's not even close. What we can look into is the sort of policies which he has promoted, him and his bloc of politicians have promoted in the National Assembly. So it's worth reminding your listeners that Juan Guaido comes from being a deputy in the National Assembly, a two-term deputy for the hard-right First Will Party. The hard-right Popular Will Party, my mistake. And in the National Assembly, these sort of policies which they have attempted to bring through include the vast privatization, as you mentioned, of the housing program, of the food programs, of a range of other nationalized or public systems here in Venezuela. There are also very strong rumors of pre-signed deals with the World Bank and the IMF, which along the lines of what happened in Argentina a few years ago, when there was a change in government from the Kirchners to the current neoliberal government, would basically see a huge bailout packages for Venezuela with massive conditions in terms of workers' rights and in terms of infringing on the democratic principles of the country. So this is something we have seen from Juan Guaido. But beyond this, and the proposal for amnesty for his political cronies, very little is still known about what he plans to do for the country. No? However, there is a saying here in Venezuela which basically says, tell me who your friends are and I'll tell you who you are. No? So if we look at who Juan Guaido is with, who does he talk to, who does he associate himself with? And here we can start to see a little bit more about where he would look to take the country. No? So his first international trips as the self-proclaimed interim president of the Republic of Venezuela was to meet Ivan Duque. Ivan Duque is a hard right politician. He then went to Brazil to meet a neo-fascist president, and he is now currently in Paraguay. He said he was honored to sit alongside U.S. State Secretary in Bogota last weekend. No, honored was his word. This tells you a lot about who Juan Guaido is and what his policies would be should he ever one day have any actual real power in Venezuela. No, it's also worth pointing out when we're talking about Juan Guaido that he is, after Donald Trump and his group, the only other person left in the world who has yet to rule out direct military action in Venezuela. No, even his allies in Bogota and in Brasilia have done this. Even the European Union had ruled out supporting any direct military action to achieve regime change in Venezuela. The only people in the whole world who are yet to do this is the White House, Donald Trump and so on, and their man here in Venezuela, Juan Guaido. Everyone else has said it's off the table, no? Including the Lima Group, including some key US allies in the region. No? So this tells you a little bit more about who Juan Guaido is and basically how he is subordinated to the White House policies. He is a man essentially without a political agenda of his own. He is a man without any sort of political program for the country or new ideas, let alone interest in development for the country. He is a puppet. He is a puppet of Donald Trump, who is unknown to the Venezuelans still, despite all of this political circus and attempted coup d'etat. And at the moment, he is outside of the country. He says he's going to try and make it back into the country tomorrow or on Monday, but perhaps. If he does, there is a very good chance he will be arrested for the crimes he has committed, or he may decide to remain in exile. Only time will tell.
I watched a lot of the live feed coming out of the United Nations Security Council when the U.S. called an emergency meeting after the February 23rd publicity stunt, when the U.S. called this emergency meeting to discuss Venezuela. And I think it was very telling when we're talking about the international community. So much of the media within the U.S. Has kind of tried to create the illusion or create the image that the quote unquote international community is behind Juan Guaido and the overthrow of the Venezuelan government. When in fact, if you go and you look at the United Nations Security Council, or if you generally look at the kind of list of countries who have continued to recognize the Maduro government. In fact, it is the government under Maduro. It is the Venezuelan government as it sits today, not Juan Guaido, that has the vast majority of international support. And I think it's very telling that the countries that have supported that have supported Juan Guaido's attempt at a coup here, it's all just kind of these like major colonial powers. It's the colonial powers. It's like essentially the U.S., the richest countries in Europe, and a few kind of like right wing puppet or satellite states or otherwise. Like it's very, that makes it very clear how colonialist this entire project is. So I'm wondering though, in terms of what we expect next, or what we can kind of expect next, what are sort of the prospects for what happens next if the U.S. does try military intervention in Venezuela? I mean, it seems almost unthinkable, but with the Trump administration clearly wants people to believe that's on the table, and who knows. So I'm wondering what sort of the prospects are, either with a U.S. military attempt invasion, otherwise military interference, the way we saw in Iraq in the 90s, for instance, or otherwise kind of the menacing, again, like extreme far right governments of Ivan Duque in Colombia and Jair Bolsonaro in the literal neo-fascist who said that the problem with Brazil's military dictatorship was they didn't kill enough people. So that's who's sitting on the Venezuelan borders. What do we kind of, or what do you kind of predict might happen, like in sort of the general range of options here? Where does this go?
Well, just before I answer that, just to quantify what you were trying to explain there, 25% of the world's governments have recognized the coup against Nicolas Maduro. 25% of the governments have recognized Juan Guaido as the legitimate authority in Venezuela. 75% of the world continues to have normal diplomatic relations with the only elected government in the country. No, we break this down by region. Only one African country has recognized Juan Guaido, which is Morocco, which doesn't even elect its head of its state. Only one Middle Eastern country has recognized Juan Guaido, that's Israel, for fairly obvious reasons. Only one country in the whole of Asia and Oceania has recognized Juan Guaido, and that's Australia. No, around half of Europe has, not all of Europe, half of Europe. Around half of the Americas have. Essentially, not a single country from the Caribbean has. No? So when he does talk about the international community supporting him and so on, we have to be very careful about what we're talking about. He's talking about the economic powers and the imperialist powers. He's not talking about the whole world. No? Now, sorry, just to answer your question about what was to come. Well, I think the threat of any direct overt military intervention against Venezuela is dwindling by the day. No? And this is, of course, a great relief for everyone here in Venezuela and in the region as a whole, I think. The attempts to seize power by Juan Guaido are very quickly losing momentum. No? I remember seeing 2 days ago a piece of propaganda produced by a far-right student group in the locality where I am in. And the headline of this propaganda was, "Don't throw in the towel." No? Now, this, I think, says a lot, because this shows that they themselves are recognizing that people are starting to lose hope in him. People are starting to condemn him to the dustbin of history of people who have offered the world in terms of changing their government, but have really not delivered in any sort of concrete form. No, there is a massive amount of demotivation within his support base here in Venezuela. In the international arena, we've seen time and time attempts to bring about regime change fail, firstly through the humanitarian aid, secondly through support for any sort of military intervention, no? And a few other examples as well. So he's definitely a man who is losing allies very, very quickly. He is a man who is losing any sort of political momentum he may have generated a month or so ago. No? But this in itself is dangerous. No? If Donald Trump is, as we suspect he is, intent on achieving regime change this time, to intent on achieving what his predecessors were not able to achieve in Venezuela, which is the imposition of a US-friendly government in Caracas, then the options which he himself has said are all on the table are ever becoming less viable for his government. No? So whereas a month ago, there was an option of a military uprising within the Venezuelan armed forces, according to the White House, and there was the option of penetrating the border with humanitarian aid. These are both options which have very clearly been ruled out now by the events of the last month or so. And as Trump's options become ever fewer, he will be thinking more and more about any sort of military intervention into the country. No? The US government are yet to rule this out. Now, this intervention may take a variety of different forms. It may be a direct, overt intervention in the style of Iraq, no, or Afghanistan. It may be a completely covert operation in style of Nicaragua, no, funding local groups, sending in arms, sabotage, acts of terrorism, no. Or it may be something more along the lines of what the US have tried to do in Syria, no. Obviously, there are very important disparities which probably time prohibit us from getting into properly today, Brian, between Venezuela and Syria, Venezuela and Iraq, and Venezuela and Nicaragua. But the fact that the US are not sending in the Marines yet does not mean that they've ruled out military intervention into the country. This military intervention may be for them entirely covert. No, and this is something which is also a lot harder to unveil and disclose to the international community and to the press, but nonetheless has a devastating impact on the country and on the quality of life for ordinary Venezuelans. No, so I think this is something which everyone has to be very wary of. The fact that we don't see the US warships bombing the northern coast of Venezuela as they did in Iraq or in Libya doesn't mean that there is not military action against Venezuela. The fact that they don't announce a war does not mean that there are not covert military operations being planned and being carried out in the region. No, so this, I think, is probably where things are more likely to go. There is now not international support for any overt military action. If the US decided to do it, they would be very, very isolated, even more so than they were when they intervened in Iraq for the second time, I would say. But that doesn't mean that they're not going to push for basically the few options they have left to achieve their political objectives in the region, which is regime change.
So much of that is so important. We're going to go ahead and have to wrap it up there. We have been speaking with Paul Dobson, an editor with Venezuelanalysis. For those of you who may not be familiar with Venezuelanalysis, I consider it to be the kind of best source of information coming out of Venezuela right now. Has been kind of fiercely in ways that very few media outlets in any country are. Venezuelanalysis has been fiercely independent in its analysis of the politics of Venezuela and the international politics surrounding the country, including this attempt at regime change. So I'm always fortunate to get to highlight the work of Venezuelanalysis and to bring Paul and so many other wonderful analysts onto the show. Thank you very much, Paul, for joining us once again.
My pleasure, Brian. Good to be here.
You are listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 FM in Austin, and it's also syndicated on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We are also available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. Stay tuned. This is Gloria La Riva, who is a 2016 presidential candidate for the PSL, receiving more votes than any socialist on the ballot since 1976, speaking about the worker situation in Latin America. To hear more of these interviews, you can find our show on SoundCloud, Spreaker, and iTunes by typing in People's Republic, where you can find the entire set.
Latin America is not getting much attention in the news of the United States, except to portray the countries in progressive struggle, revolutionary struggle, as basket cases, deserving of U.S. intervention to rescue it, really to rescue the resources for the U.S. That's all you really hear about Venezuela and Nicaragua, blaming them for what the U.S. is really responsible for. But it's not possible to understand what's taken place in either of those two countries without looking at the developments and events of the last 10 years in Latin America. Well, of course, before that, from 2009 to 2018. The decade before that, from 1999 to 2009, there was significant movement forward with the election of progressive presidents in several countries, starting with Hugo Chávez's election in Venezuela, which started the Bolivarian Revolution. He was elected in 1998, took office in 1999. Evo Morales became president in Bolivia in 2005. Rafael Correa in Ecuador in 2006. Then Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua was later that year and reelected in 2009, actually 2011 and 2016. There were also the elections in that decade between 1999 and 2009 of Lula da Silva of the Workers' Party in Brazil and Nestor Kirchner and later his wife Cristina Fernandez in Argentina, which began in 2003. Those two were not socialist, but relatively progressive, and improve the conditions of the working class in their countries. And of course, there is Cuba's steadfastness in defending its revolution for so many years. All of this was taking place in the decade of the 2000s. There was so much progress. And yet now the people of Latin America are experiencing a serious and often violent setback in their countries, counter-revolutionary attacks. And the U.S. government is behind the fostering of that opposition. And of course, James from the Alliance for Global Justice from Arizona just talked about the crisis in Colombia. In recent months, U.S. officials are intensifying pressure on their allies in Latin America against those progressive governments. Former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson appealed to elements within the Bolivarian military to overthrow President Nicolás Maduro, and Trump has threatened military action. Mike Pence's visit to Ecuador in late June was followed immediately by the new right-wing Ecuadorian President Lenin Moreno's announcement that whistleblower Julian Assange would likely not be given refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. In the last 10 years, as I said, the government has intensified its efforts, covert and overt, to recover its place of geopolitical and economic domination in Latin America and the Caribbean. U.S. funds are being poured into destabilization campaigns of subversion to reverse the revolutionary turn in the continent. And it's having a serious effect. But despite the most blatant racist and imperialist actions of Trump, this new offensive of the United States against Latin America did not start with his administration. The latest offensive started, in fact, with President Barack Obama soon after he took office in 2009. After all, one of the first actions of his government was to support, if not engineer, the Honduran coup against the president, Mel Zelaya. And of course, Hillary Clinton, being the Secretary of State, boasted in her book of her role in supporting the new coup government until her second edition when she took that little part out to run for president. Of course, let's not forget during Obama's first term the destruction of Libya and the devastating war that began against Syria. The Democrats' role cannot be overlooked, as others have said, or ignored, because as the 2020 election cycle looms before us, even before the midterm elections of November, the progressive movement and working class will be told once again that the only way out of their crisis that we are facing, economic, social, political, is to put aside protests. Don't pressure the Democrats. Work all that you can in the next 2 years. Ignore history and support them to become the new party to rule. But the history of the U.S. and Latin America and the Caribbean, whether Democrat, Republican, has been of military coups, CIA plots to overthrow governments who did not have elections that turned out in its favor, assassinate leaders, all to back U.S. corporate and geopolitical interests. And it was Obama who clearly signaled this new tactical approach in U.S. strategy of domination when he was first campaigning for president in 2008. He gave his Latin America themed speech in May 2008 in Miami, that city being the seat of the Latin American counter-revolution. In fact, he spoke before the Cuban American National Foundation, the notorious group founded under Reagan's term that was designed to strengthen the policy of strangling the Cuban economy. The foundation also received tens of millions of dollars in CIA funding to carry out terrorist attacks against Cuba. So here was Obama in Miami with this fascist group, and he announced a new approach to achieve the same goal. Here's a telling excerpt from his speech. He said, "Since the Bush administration's action launched a misguided war in Iraq, its policy in the Americas has been negligent toward our friends, ineffective with our adversaries, and incapable of advancing our interests in the region. No wonder, then, that demagogues like Hugo Chavez have stepped into the vacuum. His predictable yet perilous mix of anti-American rhetoric, authoritarian government, and checkbook diplomacy offers the same false promise as the tried and failed ideologies of the present." He means socialism. He goes on, "But the United States is so alienated from the rest of the Americas that this stale vision has gone unchallenged and has even made inroads from Bolivia to Nicaragua. And Chavez and his allies are not the only ones filling the vacuum. While the United States fails to address this changing reality in the Americas, others from Europe and Asia, notably China, have stepped up their own engagement. Iran has drawn closer to Venezuela, and just the other day, Tehran and Caracas launched a joint bank with their windfall oil profits." That's the Monroe Doctrine talking. So when Obama mentioned Hugo Chavez's checkbook diplomacy, he was condemning the idea that a country like Venezuela could control its own resources for the benefit of its people and other peoples and countries, and thus keep it out of the hands of Exxon and other oil giants. Let's not forget that hundreds of millions of gallons for several years were donated by Venezuela to poor communities in New York City, in Boston, and in native reservations during the winters. Why was Obama so bothered by Nicaragua and Bolivia and Venezuela, to mention them? It's because the decade of the 2000s was the unprecedented uniting of governments and countries that were breaking away from the very domination of U.S. imperialism. It hadn't happened before on this scale. By 2004, Venezuela and Cuba had founded the ALBA Alliance, which stands for Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas. It meant the member nations of this organization who joined would share resources and human solidarity on an equitable basis. It was Cuban doctors and teachers being sent by the tens of thousands to these countries. In turn, Venezuela provided oil and other countries provided food. Each year, more countries were inspired to join. With Cuba and Venezuela as the beginning of this organization, in 2006, peoples of Latin America, fed up with cutbacks, poverty, neoliberal programs, responded by electing similar leftist candidates. In that year, Daniel Ortega, who had been a leader of the Nicaraguan 1979 revolution before it was devastated by a U.S. contra-war which killed more than 50,000 people, he was reelected in 2006 with 38% of the vote. In his first term, economic reforms to benefit the population began to turn the economy around, also with the help of ALBA resources. A literacy campaign led by Cuban teachers made Nicaragua the third country in Latin America to be free of illiteracy. The second was Venezuela, with the help of Cuban teachers, and the first was Cuba, of course, in 1961. Ortega's vote, his election, the second time around, grew from 38% to 62% in 2011. And 2 years ago, he won a third time with 72% of the vote and 5 parties running against him. This is the country that the U.S. has targeted precisely for that reason. And Ecuador, well, Rafael Correa was elected in 2006 on a platform of challenging the banks, which had enormously increased the country's debts. He was elected the same year as Ortega. His government, called the Citizen Revolution, declared a drastic reduction in what the government would pay to the IMF and World Bank. That's taken on the U.S. Much of the country's income was used instead for social programs, healthcare, education, and poverty was reduced from 36.7% to 22.5% in 10 years. New constitution. But probably what angered the U.S. most about Correa was that the only U.S. military base in Latin America at the time was in Ecuador, Manta Air Base, and he refused to renew the lease. It was shut down 3 years into his presidency. And of course, Colombia took up the slack with several military bases being built now. Evo Morales was elected in 2004 and has been reelected since then. What was his crime in the eyes of U.S. imperialism? Well, Bolivia has one of the largest reserves of natural gas in the world, just almost limitless, and oil as well. Before his presidency, the hydrocarbon corporations, mainly U.S., but European too, paid only 18% of the profits to the Bolivian state. A new law changed that and flipped the percentage to the corporations having to pay 82% of their profits to the state. This enabled an increase in pensions, wages, reduction in poverty, schools, and other development. As you may know, Nicaragua's revolution of 1979 was devastated by 11 years of U.S. direct financing of the Contra War, which killed, as I said, 50,000 people. The aim was to destroy the revolution. More than $1 billion was poured by the U.S. to fund the Contra-terrorists. And finally, after 11 years and the exhaustion of the population, the FSLN, the Liberation Force, agreed to elections, which they lost. And so the right wing had their way for 16 years. Poverty grew. Neoliberalism grew. U.S. domination grew. This is why Daniel Ortega was elected 3 times recently. So what was the supposed reason for the latest outbreak of violence in Nicaragua, which has not happened in years? I have met right-wing Nicaraguans who live in the U.S., in San Francisco, who have been to Nicaragua lately, who even remarked positively how much peace there has been in the country and how much development there has been that they have seen. Well, the excuse for the violence was that the government was proposing changes to the pension system in April. For example, lowering future payments, increasing by a small percentage the part that the workers would have to pay into the pension plan, and the corporations had to pay a much higher percentage. The aging of the populations in many countries has put into risk a lot of pension plans. Well, that was the pretext, and suddenly young masked gangs of youth were engaging in violent attacks, burning down buildings, now killing more than 260 people. I know from my own workplace experience with our pension and all the years I worked, that young people do not protest the issue of pensions. That's not the first thing on their minds. When I was working, if you were under 40, you were fighting for a bigger wage. When you're over 40, you were fighting for that money to go into your pension. Why were there no older people protesting? Because it was an attempt at a putsch in Nicaragua that comes from the playbook of the CIA, much like the scene of Venezuela a few years ago. Unfortunately, some of the left in the U.S. is buying into the U.S. position, hook, line, and sinker. And this completely mistaken position in seeing people in the street protesting and thinking, well, I identify with that. Well, how can you identify with people who burn buildings and kill? Schools, government buildings. It's a completely engineered plot. In fact, between 2014 and 2017, the CIA front, known as the National Endowment for Democracy, or NED, spent $4.2 million that we know of to create the opposition that would overthrow Ortega. But the other day, and you can see in Liberation News on the website that was just posted, an article that shows that hundreds of thousands of people out of a population that's only a few million are in the streets defending the government and their country. What's the unfolding situation as we speak? Luis da Silva, the most popular person, political person in Brazil who would definitely win an election if he were allowed to run, is now in prison, sentenced to 12 years, thanks to an engineered coup against President Dilma Rousseff, who was also expelled, and then the false persecution of Lula. However, in these days, there's a massive mobilization on different fronts of people in Brazil who are running him for president again, even though he's not allowed, who are engaging in all kinds of mobilization for his right to be free. Rafael Correa, who I mentioned before, third-term president from 2007 to 2017, declared the international debt illegitimate, among other things, is now a hunted man. He's in Belgium. And with the right-wing government of this new president, Moreno, this judge has ordered his extradition from Belgium. She's asked for Interpol to arrest him and extradite him to Ecuador. The purpose of it is to prevent him from being a leader again in the country. And it's highly likely that U.S. Vice President Mike Pence issued the dictate for his arrest, since he visited Ecuador 4 days before that order.
That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic is produced at KOOP Community Radio in Austin, Texas, and is also syndicated on WHIV 102.3 FM in New Orleans. You can find our show on SoundCloud, iTunes, Spreaker, Spotify, and Stitcher by typing in People's Republic, or you can visit us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX. Thanks for listening as we report on the global struggle for social and economic justice. We are out of here.